He set the paper on the kitchen counter like it was a landmine, and then he looked at me as if the word that had always wrapped us, family, could be peeled off and put in a drawer. He said, slowly, as if talking to a stranger, "The lab says he's not mine." For a second, I thought I'd misheard. The clock over the stove ticked. A bus rumbled on Maple Avenue. The kettle, forgotten, whistled and then quieted. Outside, the neighbor's dog barked at nothing. Inside, the moment felt enormous and small at the same time. Enormous because everything we'd built could be torn loose by a sheet of paper. Small because the boy who toddled through our living room carrying a plastic dinosaur still had the same goofy grin and the same chipped front tooth. He was exactly the same child I'd changed diapers for, exactly the same child who reached for me at night with sticky hands. DNA wouldn't change his fingers. My name is Claire. We live in a split level on the east side of Columbus, Ohio. Teacher, coffee in an enamel mug, a herd of mismatched sneakers by the back door. My husband, Mark, is methodical. Engineering manager, neat piles of receipts, an ability to get bored with small talk and zero patience for uncertainty. We had tried for years to have kids. We did the rounds of clinics, the months of hope that collapsed into nothing, until finally the doctors suggested IVF. I'll spare you the blood work, the injections, the early morning drives to the clinic, the parade of sterile rooms where strangers in scrubs handled the most intimate pieces of our future. You either understand that kind of trust, or you don't. For me, trusting those white coats was survival. For Mark, apparently, it never was. He'd been suspicious for a while. "They look different," he'd muttered, not cruelly, just like a man cataloging mismatched socks. He would squint at pictures and say, "I don't see my nose on either of them." I'd roll my eyes, little jabs that became a knot in my chest. You'd think months of trying would build only gratitude and a kind of awe, but infertility leaves tiny fissures in a marriage. It leaves one person clinging and the other scanning for cracks. You learn the catalog of each other's fears. Mine was that the clinic would fail us again. His was that someone could take something of his and, without asking, hand it to someone else. He ordered tests half-secretly. He called it peace of mind. He told me it was one of those genealogy kits you send away with saliva and forget about if I asked, and if I pushed, he said, "It's just to see where we come from." He asked for cheek swabs, and I said nothing, because saying the truth, that I didn't want a lab's verdict to ripple through our house, would only make him more determined. I knew better than to make ultimatums about trust when the well was already a little dry. When the envelope arrived, he tore it open like a man opening a bill. The result was simple and cold. The probability of paternity for our son, age 2, came back at less than 1%. For our daughter, age 4, the test said she was his. Only the boy registered as not his. The lab's language was clinical. "Inconsistent with paternity," recommended further testing. For Mark, it was a thunderclap. For me, it was a corridor of questions with no lights on. The first hours after that felt like being underwater. Mark paced. He alternated between a fury that made his hands shake and a blankness that made the room feel too large for our bodies. He stopped looking at our son with the casual, always sure tenderness he used to show. He would lift him, hold him, and then I saw it check the child's face as if it were a book he'd never read before. At breakfast, he set the cereal down, stirred, then pushed his chair back and left for work without saying goodbye. He texted his mother, and minutes later their voices, lower than usual, floated from the phone. "I don't know what to think." We did what a lot of couples do in those first frantic hours. We sought answers. Mark wanted a court-ordered test immediately, then a full panel that would check everything twice. I dragged my feet. I understood his need for clarity in a way that frightened me. If DNA said he wasn't the father, would he still be the dad? Would he still read Goodnight Moon in that slow, patient voice? Would the grandparents still make that goofy fuss when our son shoved a new crayon behind his ear? Would the family continue, or would it be a line interrupted? Here is the ugly truth about tests. They promise certainty and instead expose edges that existed before but hadn't been named. The test didn't create suspicion. It made it visible. It forced my husband to stand opposite a history neither of us wanted to be true. And once suspicion is named, it invites tribunals. Who was responsible, who knew more, who was negligent? Our first suspect was the clinic. Where else could an answer come from? People tell stories about sample mix-ups, wrong embryos, clerical errors at frozen embryo banks. Some of these stories are mythic, some are true. I had always believed clinics were systems designed to minimize human error. Now I was not sure. The low point, the night when grief and dread braided together, came a week later. Mark wanted to sleep on the couch upstairs. He said he needed space to think. I lay awake with our son's little foot in my hair and a dictionary-sized legal site open on my laptop. "We could sue," I whispered into the dark, the idea terrible and inevitable. "We could subpoena the clinic, demand records, push for a chain of custody review." You could hear the desperation in that sentence. Knowledge, I realized, begins with paperwork. If the clinic had been sloppy, if embryos had been misidentified, if labels had been swapped, we could find proof. If not, it would only deepen the cleavage. I made a choice that night, not dramatic but determined. I would not let fear decide our family's fate. I would gather facts slowly and methodically, the same way a teacher grades papers, not for sensation, but for patterns. If this was negligence, I would document it. If this was a crisis in my marriage, I would face it. If this was something darker, infidelity, deceit, I wanted the evidence to stand on its own. First step, understanding what a DNA test could and couldn't tell us. I called a genetic counselor at a hospital downtown and sat in a small office that smelled faintly of bleach and old magazines. She explained things I should have known already. Cheek swab tests from a consumer kit are reliable for paternity in most cases, but lab error, sample contamination, and administrative mistakes, while rare, did happen. "You need chain of custody testing," she said. That means the sample was collected and processed with verifiable documentation and witnesses. It's not perfect, but it's admissible in court and harder to dispute. Chain of custody would be my front line if we were to press the issue beyond our kitchen arguments. Next, I called the clinic. Their receptionist was sympathetic, the sort of sympathy that lives in scripts. "We value patient safety. We have strict protocols." They told me the clinic had internal audits. They promised a review and emailed me a packet of generic policy documents that read like a consumer warranty. I kept them. Every email, every phone call. I printed each confirmation and laid them out on our dining table like a scavenger hunt map for truth. Meanwhile, the house unraveled in small ways. Mark started dropping things, keys, the habit of leaving his socks where he had always left them. On a Saturday, he accidentally left the stroller in the garage, and when our son stumbled on the pavement, he reacted with a flinch that nearly broke me. He would hover in doorways and then step back. I began to measure our life in small half-steps. I reached out to allies. The first was my sister, Jenna, who lived in Cleveland and spoke in practical sentences that had the edge of someone who grew up without a lot of drama. "Document everything. Don't let anyone tell you words are enough." The second was Mara, a friend from the IVF group, who texted, "This is why we kept copies." She had a box, a literal shoebox, of everything from consent forms to frozen embryo receipts. I drove to her house and borrowed the idea of a box. I started a file folder labeled Chain, Clinic, Communication. Good grief had a funny way of translating into administrative rigor. Turning point, the moment when reaction turned to strategy, came when the clinic's internal audit returned with only a cursory apology and an unobjectionable statement. No errors found. They recommended retesting, at their expense, using a different lab. Mark, raw and brittle, wanted to accept it. "Let them retest," he said. "If they're sincere, they'll prove there was no mistake." But the genetic counselor had warned me that a clinic-sponsored retest could be structured to limit liability. I insisted on independent testing with documented chain of custody and an independent lab of recognized reputation in another state. Chain of custody testing is bureaucratic in the best sense: witnesses, signatures, sealed envelopes, notary stamps. It meant returning to the clinic, demanding specific forms, and refusing to leave until the process was followed with visible skeletons of verification. I remember the clinic coordinator's face when I asked for a notary to be present in the collection room, as if I'd asked for a diva's request. "It's standard for legal cases," I said, and my voice was steady. The results were a blow that felt like a rerun of the first. The independent lab's report, delivered in a PDF that looked impossibly official, confirmed the consumer kit. The child was not genetically Mark's. At that point, something inside the room shifted from fear to a kind of cold clarity. If the child was not Mark's and the clinic said their chain of custody was intact, then the explanation could be either human heartbreak, a breach of trust between spouses, or institutional failure, an error in the lab, or, worse, something deliberate. It was time to widen the scope. We filed a formal complaint with the state medical board. We hired a lawyer who specialized in reproductive law. Her name was Sarah. She was 40, efficient, and she liked a good folder with tabs. "We'll serve subpoenas," she said. "We'll request all inventory logs from the embryo storage unit, signing sheets, lab technician notes, video logs where available." She laid out a map: chain of custody records, incident reports, third-party audits, even payroll records for the embryology staff. If there was negligence, it would be visible in inconsistencies. Missing timestamps, unsigned logs, a vacuum where a system should be. Discovery is a strange thing. It is mechanical and personal at once. We sat in a conference room, wrapped in the hush of office lamps, while Sarah read back entries that were supposed to be daily and neat. "Here," she said, pointing to a printout. "The incubator logs jump. There's a gap between 3:00 and 7:00 a.m. on April 18th. The technician on duty signed in at 2:55, then out at 7:05. But surveillance shows movement in the storage room during that period." The clerk from the clinic tried to explain that the logging system experienced a temporary outage. "Outages mean nothing without incident reports," Sarah said, "and the incident reports around those dates are thin." Then a quieter, more human piece of evidence arrived. A former embryologist who'd left the clinic months earlier, a woman named Leela, called us anonymously at first, then agreed to meet in a diner with LEDs buzzing overhead. She slid a small envelope across the formica. Inside were photocopies of handwritten notes. "We were understaffed. We were pressured to move cases faster," she said, her hands wrapped around a lukewarm coffee. Sometimes labels were taped on the counter and later reattached. Sometimes we were told not to document minor swaps to save time. It seemed small until someone realized an embryo was in the wrong tank. Her voice trembled and then hardened. "I reported it. Nothing changed." Whistleblower testimony is fragile, but it is also potent. Leela's notes, paired with the technical gaps in logs and the odd out-of-sequence timestamps, began to look like a pattern. Sarah filed motions for preservation of evidence and requested internal communications. The clinic's PR team went into overdrive. They posted on social media about our commitment to patient safety. They offered free counseling to their patients, and they expressed regret for any anxiety. That pattern, public calm, private obfuscation, is a recurring chapter in institutional scandals. Local news picked up the story. Once that happened, things accelerated in a way that felt both inevitable and grotesque. A reporter from the city paper called asking tough questions. A morning show producer wanted a segment about what to ask your clinic. People with similar stories reached out via email and DM. We weren't alone. Another family 3 counties over told us they'd found mismatched embryo IDs in their records. The county health department opened an investigation. The clinic's reputation, once polished and carefully maintained, began to crack. The courtroom is not a place of dramatic speeches in most cases. It's a place of documents, witnesses, and the slow assembling of truth. The prosecution of the clinic, civil suits, licensing board hearings, administrative sanctions, moved at a pace that is strangely patient. We subpoenaed personnel records, staff schedules, training logs, incident reports. We demanded the chain of custody for every embryo stored in the months surrounding our procedure. We had Leela testify. We had the independent lab experts explain how cross-contamination and mislabeling occur. The clinic's defense team argued human error was isolated and not systemic, that the chain of custody policies were followed in spirit, and that outcome could not be proven to match the mistake. Then a critical document surfaced. In a folder of emails, a line stood out, an internal message from a supervisory embryologist to a manager, an apology about a mislabeled tank dated 6 months before our procedure. The email read in part, "I flagged tank 3 as problematic. We retagged a handful of samples, no patient complaints yet. Please advise." The admission, buried and seemingly hushed, gave weight to the whistleblower's notes. It showed the clinic had been aware of risk and had chosen to push forward without full remediation. When the state board suspended the clinic's license pending a full audit, it felt like a small, legalized thunderclap. For us, it was a relief wrapped in a bargain, confirmation that we had not been paranoid, but not the healing one hopes for. The auditor's final report, released months later, documented procedural lapses, missing equipment logs, insufficient staff training, and questionable labeling protocols. The report recommended corrective action and proposed that patients affected be contacted. Financial penalties followed. The clinic set up a fund for affected families and offered support for relocation of care. The embryology director resigned. That was the institutional downfall. It was not cinematic. There were no chains being clattered or melodramatic shoutouts. Instead, there were legal forms, negotiated settlements, and a long list of details to sort: refunds, alternative fertility options, and the psychological cost of being told you might not be the parent of the child you've raised. The court did not deliver a neat moral victory. It delivered remediation and accountability. For many, that is the most we can ask of systems built by humans. What happened inside our marriage was messier. Having evidence that a clinic had been sloppy did not magically repair the wound of suspicion. There were things you cannot legislate away. The look in Mark's eyes when he first held our son, and then later when he read the lab report. The way the grandparents asked furtive questions, the small avoidance at family dinners. We attended counseling, both together and separately. We let the professionals point out where grief masqueraded as blame, and where blame needed to be heard rather than dismissed. Slowly, through therapy and stubborn, everyday parenting, some things knit back. Mark relearned how to look at our son without checking his face for proof of paternity. He started volunteering at preschool pickup again. He learned to accept that fatherhood is not only about genetic certainty, but about the way you show up when a fever hits at 2 a.m., or how you braid tiny hair before kindergarten. I, for my part, learned how fragile certainty can be and how stubbornly love persists. We made lists of rituals we would not relinquish. Saturday pancakes, Friday story time, the way we celebrate scraped knees. We made legal choices, too. We finalized a settlement with the clinic that covered counseling and the cost of additional testing, and we amended our wills and guardianship plans to reflect the life we all lived, not the genetics behind it. There is a truth at the center of this that felt radical when I first told it to a counselor. The child didn't change. The boy who climbed our laps, who roared with giggles at blanket forts, who chewed the corner of library cards, he was the same. The difference was in how other adults chose to see him. That, in the end, is what matters. The social contract of parenthood is as powerful as any genetic marker, but it needs the protection of law when institutions fail and of empathy when human fear intrudes. If you're watching this because you've been handed a test result that undoes your certainty, here are 3 practical things I wish someone had handed me in those first dizzying days. 1. Prioritize documented testing. If you suspect an error or need legally admissible results, request chain of custody testing with an independent lab. Do not rely only on a single consumer kit or a clinic-run retest. Chain of custody establishes who touched a sample and when. It gives medical records teeth in legal settings. 2. Build a slow, evidence-based plan before you act. Panic pushes people to make irreversible choices, accusations, threats, cutting ties, that you may regret. Consult a genetic counselor to understand what tests can tell you, and then speak with a lawyer who specializes in reproductive or family law to understand your options and likely outcomes. 3. Protect the child emotionally and legally. Children are not legal or moral tools, they are vulnerable people. Whether you pursue litigation, a medical complaint, or private resolution, ensure there is a plan for the child's care and continuity. Counseling support, maintained routines, and legal documents, wills, guardianship, custody agreements, that reflect the life you want to preserve for them. Finally, no test changes the nights you stayed up when they had fevers. No test erases the first time they said mama or dada. If you are a parent who has doubts thrust upon you, remember this. Biology can explain dissent, but it doesn't define devotion. If you are a partner betrayed by doubt, remember this. The urge for certainty can feel primal, but the work of deciding who to be to a child is a choice you get to make again and again. We lost certainty for a while. We found something else. A slower, voluntary commitment that was harder to prove on paper and far more important to live out. In the end, family is less about a letter in the genome and more about the letters we write with our care. That's the proof I choose to keep.